Colonel Macgregor, a pleasure as always. Thank you. I do want to talk to you about President Trump's dwindling options to escape from the mess he and Benjamin Netanyahu have created in Iran. But before that, I want to talk about military preparedness. When the Pentagon prepares an operation of the magnitude that President Trump apparently ordered, what steps do they take and how long does the preparation take?
Well, this is an important question. It goes to the heart of a serious problem that we have in defense. We have a short war posture that permeates the entire Defense Department. If you go back to 1990-91, you had this enormous rapid buildup of forces and supplies and ships organized into supply chains. Same thing with aircraft, civil aircraft, military aircraft. And within a remarkably short time, from all over the planet came forces. Now, we were lucky we were able to do this without interference from any of the missiles that Saddam Hussein had at his disposal, which, had he used them, could have been devastating. But the point is, we had on hand, on our shelves, plans regarding how you would mobilize and move all kinds of forces, air, space, sea, and also how you would re-task satellites and satellite arrays in space to support the communications and operations. So we were prepared because we had spent decades preparing potentially to fight the Soviets in Central Europe. So that was assumed to be a potentially long war. Now, there were different estimates, but the point was that you had to be able to fight for at least 6 months, if not longer. And that, of course, would then be accompanied by national mobilization and so forth. We don't have that, Judge. There was no mobilization per se. We were living on whatever still exists. You've heard people say that we Americans have been living essentially on the industrial capital that was built by our ancestors. In other words, the scientific industrial base that emerges between, say, 1920 and 1960. And they're right. That's what we've been living on. We haven't gone out to build a new scientific industrial base per se, as China has in other countries. Well, the same thing is true in the military. We haven't done that because we picked opponents, whether they were in the Balkans, they turned out to be the Serbs, or later on, people like the Libyans, the Iraqis, the Yemenis, any number of different peoples. And the conflicts were short, and it didn't require a great deal of effort or military power to dominate them. And so we became used to this particular setting. This was the problem the British had before World War I. They were used to fighting what they called opponents inside the empire. And for our purposes, the Middle East, Africa, maybe Latin America under certain circumstances, but no preparation to fight a powerful continental enemy. So what do you get? You get what we've got. You take what you have, you hurl it at Iran, which was from day one grossly underestimated and misunderstood, and you come up short. And so we have a Navy that was not prepared for long terms at sea, didn't have the depth in the force, didn't have the depth in the personnel, and we're paying a price for it right now.
So Benjamin Netanyahu apparently talks President Trump into fighting the war on two occasions, around New Year's Eve in Mar-a-Lago, and then about 2 weeks later at the White House. 45 days later, the assault begins. Is that enough time to organize and prepare something of this magnitude? And does the Pentagon consider the economic and cultural responses to war at home, or is that out of the Pentagon's purview?
Well, I think number one, the 45 days were not enough for what we set out to do. And this goes back to some misapprehensions. President Trump decided to embrace the Israeli assessment. Remember, the initial assessment was this government may fall apart in 4 days, at the most 2 weeks. I mean, we went through this during the Kosovo air campaign, where the comment was made when the military was asked by President Clinton, what do you think? How long is this going to last? And the answer was a few days, 10 days, maybe 2 weeks at the most. Well, it went on for 78 days. And we know that it ended when Strobe Talbot was able to go and bribe Yeltsin to drop Milosevic, at which point in time the Serbs said, well, the game's up, we pull out, we don't have any Russian support. Well, you have something similar right now, except there's nobody you can bribe. Nobody's going to listen to you. So you're stuck. And your opponent is prepared for the long haul. They've spent 20, 30 years preparing for what they thought would be an inevitable war against us. So no, 45 days was not enough. Now, as far as the second thing is concerned, when you start asking hard questions about yourself, about what is the social cohesion of the United States, what's the impact on this all-volunteer force, which in the aftermath of Vietnam, let's be frank, was kind of an expedience. It was designed to get us out of a very bad situation with the American public. And again, that force was fine for Iraq and the circumstances and the duration of that campaign, but not much beyond that. And then we made it smaller. So I think the answer to the second question is probably no. And then you've also misjudged your opponent. It's not just a question of how are we going to react and what do Americans think. I don't think there was any thought given to the possible requirement that you'd have to go out there and convince Americans that this was an existential threat and that our response had to be an existential one. It's not. Nobody believes that. And subsequently, all the efforts by the media, which is in the hands of Zionist Jewish forces, as well as the usual suspects and all the newspapers, the television, so forth, all trying to tell us, Iran is going to launch nuclear weapons in 5 years and destroy Los Angeles if we don't do this. Well, that's nonsense, and everybody knows it's nonsense. So it hasn't worked.
Do the people that really bear the burden in this war, take, for example, the 5,000 sailors and Marines, I guess it's both genders, male and female. I don't know if they have male and female on the USS Abraham Lincoln, but do people like that understand that they're not fighting a war for the United States of America?
I think if they did not understand it when we left to go fight, I think large numbers of them now believe that. Yes, I think they know this is not an existential threat to the United States and that we're fighting for some other purpose. And I'm not sure they're clear on that purpose. Someone has told them we have to destroy Iran. We have to open the strait. And they'll listen to that to a certain point, but no one has bothered to explain that this entire war is a product of the Greater Israel Project. The decision after the 7 October attacks to sort of repurpose the response to the Hamas attacks, which we now think in retrospect were allowed to happen, but to repurpose those attacks in a way that would justify a regional war for Israeli Jewish supremacy, tied up with interests here in the United States. So I think people have said, wait a minute, where's the Imperial Japanese Navy? It's not out there. We're not fighting it. Where's the Soviet Navy? It's not out there. We're not fighting it. Then what are we doing? And I don't think most people are very happy with the outcome.
Where's the Wehrmacht? It's not there.
That's right.
Right. How do we know? Well, let me backtrack a little bit. Benjamin Netanyahu not only talked Trump into this absurd war, he talked him into participating in an assassination of the Ayatollah. The
Yes.
Ayatollah was assassinated within the first 48 hours. His son, the Ayatollah that was killed, was anti-nuke and moderate. The son, we don't know where he is on nuclear weapons, but he's certainly not a moderate from the hardliners he has assembled in the government around him. Is that an understanding with which you concur?
Oh, no, you're right. And I know that Max Blumenthal has talked about that. There's also Artem Mowaini, who's a true expert on Iran and the region. And let's understand what's really happened. Sure, you've killed off the leadership that was there at the outset of the war. Surprise, surprise, the people that have risen up have turned out to be tougher, more aggressive, and fundamentally less likely to cooperate with you. That's something that the Germans discovered when they fought the Soviets. You know, Stalin had murdered an estimated, 50 to 60,000 Soviet army officers. And people inside the German general staff, many of them were convinced, well, this is going to have a terrible impact on the conduct of operations. They've weakened the Soviet armed forces. But there's always another side to this. When you remove certain people that are older, who have been in those jobs for some period of time, you suddenly remove them and replace them with younger people, new people with new sets of eyes, new ideas. Things actually get tougher for you. You end up fighting people that were better than the ones you disappeared at the beginning. Now, the difference this time around, and this is hard for people to get, this is very important. When I was at the Dayton Accords, when General Wes Clark there was advising Ambassador Holbrooke, I would sit and listen to Europeans and members of the Clinton administration, and they would talk about how all of these people in the Balkans are really the same, and all of these people would come together and understand each other. And trying to explain to people that these individuals, whatever they were before the civil war in Yugoslavia began, is now different from what they are today. Too much blood has been spilled. Too many families killed. Too many friends and sons and fathers have died. Too many women have been violated and raped, all these things. I said, what do you expect these people to embrace each other and say, oh, well, let's all bygones be bygones, love each other and get along? Nonsense. That's what's happening in Iran today. For them, this is an existential war. You're seeing the emergence of a new population, and I would argue, and Arda Moini argues, a new state, a new Islamic Republic that is going to be much tougher, much stronger, much more cohesive and determined than anything we countered or encountered in the past, much more so.
What you've just articulated, was it not known and perceived by American intelligence, but rejected by the Israelis, whom Trump chose to believe? Is this war a result of a fundamental character flaw in the President of the United States?
Well, character flaw may not be the right word. The right word might be lack of understanding, lack of confidence in his own people, because he does seem to have deferred to the Israelis along the way, Judge. I don't see any evidence that he's ever really said, no, thank you, don't agree with you, go back and re-examine your assumptions, which is normally what you say to somebody when they present you with an assessment, as Phil Giraldi or Larry Johnson can tell you. You look at this thing and say, well, listen, I've read this. I've also read your assumptions. I don't think they're right. That doesn't seem to have happened. It seems to have just been taken on uncritically by the president. And that's the fault of the 6 or 7 people that surround him, that they allowed him to do that. It was up to them to intervene and say, no, wait a minute, boss, before you buy into this 100%, let's go back and re-examine these other reports where the assumptions are different. That doesn't seem to have happened.
Well, this happened as recently as last week with the Air Force One. Mossad said, we have intel that the Iranians are going to attack the plane with a missile. You better get the president out. CIA said, no, with very low confidence in the Iranian threat. Trump chose to believe Mossad, leave his senior staff and cabinet members on the plane as a decoy and go hide in another plane because Netanyahu's people wanted to scare him.
Well, I saw some pictures of the president in one of these trucks carrying supplies for the aircraft, and several people told me he looked really good with the vegetables. Listen, I can't explain all of that. I mean, obviously, he wasn't terribly worried about having to replace the people on the other plane. That may tell you something. But beyond that, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. And if you're going to be the commander in chief of the U.S. Armed Forces in wartime, You have to listen to people that are concerned about your safety, but at some point, you can't say, I'm going to sneak out of here. I'm worried about my safety, especially when you have people in the Gulf, people at sea, people on land whose lives are at risk all the time. At some point, as president, you say, look, okay, thanks. I'm going out on Air Force One. If I don't go out on Air Force One, people will genuinely think there's something wrong. There isn't. And I don't want to be viewed negatively by the men, women that I command in the armed forces. But that did not occur to him.
Colonel, to Ukraine, did the United States Army and the Ukrainian Army recently engage in war games in Germany?
Well, this appears to have occurred in May, June timeframe. Maybe it started in April. I think I sent you the blurb about it. We conduct these kinds of exercises on a routine basis. But it's important to pay attention to this because there were apparently people quite surprised that the Ukrainians, who of course been at war now for 4 years, came in and they employed tactics that had been employed against them and some of the tactics they've employed against the Russians. And it turned out we were completely unprepared for it and we were annihilated. Now, why is this important? Does this say our army is terrible or our navy isn't right or anything else? No, that's not the point. The point is that a lot of years have gone past. Things have changed dramatically. If you were going to point to an analog for the battlefield that we face today, in other words, what you have on the ground in Ukraine, and to a lesser extent, what we're seeing today with Iran, looks a lot like World War I, Judge. In other words, people went into World War I prepared for a war of maneuver, and they lost hundreds of thousands of dead, hundreds of thousands killed, and were then forced into static positions of defense. And then suddenly became very clear to everyone the defense was superior to the offense. We spent the next 4+ years trying to break out of this defense posture, really never did. The war ended because of a state of exhaustion, and I would argue on all sides, not just the German. So the point right now I think we need to take from this is that this is a very different warfare state right now. When I say state, I mean condition. It's a lot like World War I. You're not going to be able to do the things you did in the past, behave as you did in the past. You're going to have to prepare for a very lethal environment that's different. And we're going to have to live with this environment in which the defense is superior to the offense. And I hope somebody is looking at it from that standpoint. It goes also back to the other comment. It's time to start preparing to fight a long war, because any war you get involved with as a result of the changes in technology is likely to be long, not short anymore. That assumes that you're going to travel anywhere to fight anybody. That's another question. So I think it's a good thing this information has gotten out. I hope the senior military leadership of the Army and the Marines, everybody's looking at this, because we've got to come to terms with it. If we fight in the future, we've got to expect to confront this kind of lethality and threat. We've got to plan for it. We've got to find a way to counter it.
To me, it's almost inconceivable that the Ukrainians beat the Americans and that the Ukrainians had time to engage in war games when they're fighting an existential battle against a military 5 times their size.
Well, we've paid for that. We brought them out, we set them up, and they were enabled to do this. I think whoever did it deserves credit. It was a smart thing to do. And, you know my view on this whole thing. The war, for all intents and purposes, on the ground is lost. Ukraine is not going to win anything. There is not going to be any comeback. The question is, will there even be a Ukrainian state in the future? But we can learn from this. So I'm glad that they brought out these veterans. And we did this in the 1970s. If you go back to 1977, 78, 79, there were still German generals alive who had fought on the Eastern as well as the Western fronts, fought against us, the Soviets and the British. And they did something similar with NATO. And then they were brought in to reorganize the way NATO should fight if it has to fight the Soviets. And when they were put in charge and they were allowed to make those changes, they defeated the Soviets. We had lost over and over and over again. That's one of the reasons they brought them in. I do think they had an impact. And you see changes in the U.S. Army in particular in the 1980s that reflect that influence. So this is a good thing, and we should not misinterpret it. It's not a bad thing. What would have been bad is to run another rigged exercise, and we certainly have done a lot of those, Judge.
President Putin, I don't know if this is the speech to which you refer. This is just 2 days ago. He's in uniform. He's addressing troops. And it sounds to me like he's going to attack NATO facilities. Well, you tell me what you think. Chris, number 12.
NATO is gradually seeping into the area, and new military political blocs are being formed right before our eyes. New weapon systems are currently being deployed and are also planned for deployment here, which pose serious threats to our country as well. Tensions are also being significantly ramped up in the neighboring Arctic zone, which we have already mentioned, specifically regarding the ongoing use of the Northern Sea route. Although Russia has always, and I truly mean always, consistently advocated for, and now confirms its full and complete readiness for, broad international cooperation and utilizing the many strategic advantages of the Northern Sea route for the mutual benefit of everyone involved. And those states that are genuinely interested in working with us are now showing a significant level of interest, primarily from our close friends such as China, India, and other nations. They are currently engaged in active discussions with us regarding these issues, and we will certainly welcome and encourage joint cooperation both with our friends and with all countries there.
What he's saying now is, I think, not simply Ukraine, but I think it could expand. I think we're reaching the point where we risk a confrontation with Russia at a point in time when we're not equipped for it. And again, read the subtext on Grinkiewicz. He's trying to send a signal. If the Russians decide to move decisively with theater-range ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, or unmanned systems against specific targets in Romania, Poland, Germany, Latvia, Lithuania, wherever, there's nothing he can do about it. That's not a good position to be in, but that's what he's saying. And I think Putin is saying that. Now, there's something else, and this goes back to a question you asked earlier. Robert Burns wrote a poem years ago in which he said, grant me the gift of being able to see myself the way others see me. You were asking that about the Pentagon, about the Department of Defense, and
Right.
do we see others in a realistic light? The answer is no. We've never understood the Russians. We've never tried. You know, this rules-based liberal international order nonsense throws international law out of the window. Under international law, the existing body, Russia is a sovereign state. You cannot arbitrarily violate Russia's sovereignty. We decided it doesn't matter. Democratic states, liberal democratic states, or those that fancy themselves as being liberal democratic, we can debate that, as you know, seem to think that they can do whatever the hell they want. They can challenge anybody, anytime, anywhere. They can decide what is morally right or what is morally wrong. And that's the problem. All of this is wrapped up together in this sort of insane liberal internationalism that's dragged us through the Balkans, dragged us into Africa, dragged us into the Middle East, and ultimately it's been part of the justification for war in Iran. It's crazy. It needs to stop. And the Russians are prepared to stop it. And I think we ought to take them very seriously.